Good evening, everybody. I'm Kate Barker and I'm the CEO of LGB Alliance. And welcome to our very first LGB Alliance Business Forum in Conversation, which is with Tess White MSP. So for anyone that's new to the LGB Alliance Business Forum, it's a collective of senior execs, all lesbian, gay or bisexual, who really think that this era of no debate, which has been applied to businesses, has been wholly bad for them. It's been bad for the workforces, really bad for morale, especially bad for leaders. And the aim of the forum is to work with leaders to facilitate really positive conversations about rights, especially LGB rights, and where those rights might clash, to drive some positive dialogue about solutions that within the law that might make for better business. So we are all about talking. And so tonight we are talking to Tess White, MSP, a Scottish Conservative politician since 2021, who is also the Shadow Minister for Equalities. Tess, you've been outspoken on lots of issues that are relevant to LGB people, particularly around the reality of sex. So you've spoken out against self-ID, against men in women's spaces and women's sports. And also about pro single-sex facilities, single-sex toilets for schools, for example. Now, I would imagine that your opinion has been shaped by your professional life prior to becoming an MSP, and you're extremely successful in a very tough industry, which was the oil and gas industry, where you were the board director at Shell Renewables, you were vice president at Shell International, and you were HR director at Centrica. So I think we can safely say you are somebody that understands the challenges of managing people. I have to say, when I wanted to post something on LinkedIn about you, so I Googled your picture, and there were loads of nice pictures of you looking extremely professional and doing your thing and talking in Parliament. And then I scrolled down, and there's a picture of Tess in full leathers on an enormous motorbike. Scroll. Oh, here's Tess karateing somebody in karate outfit, and here's Tess cold water swimming in a wetsuit. So I think we can agree that you are a woman of action, as well as being the consummate professional, and you are an out gay woman with a wife. So you totally tick all our boxes. So thanks very much for talking to us today. And the person who's going to be asking the questions of you is Toby Hopkins, who is one of the co-chairs of the LGB Alliance Business Forum. Now, Toby's Group HR Director for a consumer goods brand in London. He's been in the field for over a decade. He graduated with a degree in business and economics before moving into the corporate world and beginning his career working for a large food retailer. And he's really passionate, and I know Toby now, I know Toby quite well. He's really passionate about helping organisations unlock talent and create winning cultures in businesses. And so he's going to be the one, he knows what he's talking about, Tess. So I'm going to hand over to him to ask you some probing questions.
Well, thank you very much, Kate and Tess. It's great to be with you. I'll try to go easy on you, but we'll split this a little bit. We've got some questions for I know there's a large contingent of the HR community attending, so it's great to be amongst friends, as it were. So maybe let's start there before we shift into some of the areas that the LGB Alliance Forum are working on, Business Forum are working on, and I'm keen to hear about your experiences there. Just on a broad basis, then, what are when you worked in oil and gas, what were the biggest HR challenges that you had? You know, we think of oil and gas as quite a tough industry. You've got a good mix of blue collar, white collar. What are the challenges that you really find from an HR perspective in an area like that?
Thanks, Toby. By the way, you don't need to go easy on me. I'm a second dan black belt in karate, so.
And I am not. I should add. So you win that one.
I would just say, give it to me. Hit me on the chin. In fact, you won't, because I'll deflect. But in terms of the oil and gas industry, I think three areas really. The primary area is safety, both physical safety and psychological safety, and it pervades everything. The culture, you can just imagine if you just lose concentration or don't follow instructions, guidance, training, you can cause death, and not just one death, multiple deaths. So the culture and the safety culture in the energy sector is safety always, safety first. And making sure, having very effective HR leaders to shape and work with the leadership team to direct the culture and also manage the consequences properly if people are not delivering to the required standards, because it can cause death. And I think the other thing is about innovation, because oil and gas, it was oil and gas when I first started, now it's energy, because it's part renewables as well, and the energy mix is about innovation. We still are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, and in terms of the sector, it's boom and bust. So for a few years where oil is $70 a barrel, then you're doing really well, and then it can go to $50, $30, and that has tremendous consequences for the organization, both upskilling and sort of upsizing and downsizing. So the HR function and leaders have to be very nimble and flight of foot. And planning is extremely important. So having that vision of where you're going and basically galvanizing the organization to empower people so they deliver is I would say, for oil and gas. And it's a tough world, but I did my first job. I worked at Britain's only salt mine. So I started off in my early 20s in salt mining, and I worked for a large chemical company and then went into oil and gas. So it's all about skills, behaviours and competencies. I hope that answers your question, Toby.
Oh, that's super. No, and it's I think a useful, possibly a useful training ground for what's eventually being transpired in organisations, which we'll talk through a little bit. Just to stick on the topic of HR a little bit more generally, I mean, when we think of oil and gas energy, as you would say, we think of the Middle East, and there's maybe some of the conflicts that might come in with LGB people maybe being seconded into certain countries that have anti-gay laws or things like that. What sort of challenges did you encounter from that perspective in your career? How did you handle them, and what should people be aware of?
In terms of when you're working for an international organisation, so I used to spend about 50% of my time, sometimes 70% of my time travelling. I think if I talk about myself and being a gay woman, there are certain countries in the world I couldn't work in, but I've travelled to most continents and worked and had teams in most regions of the world. So I spent a lot of my time travelling to those countries that weren't accepting either of women working, or people who were gay, bisexual. And I think my key point there is my job as HR was to develop the talent, and for certain, in order to grow and be leaders of the future, you need certain types of organizational experience and geographical experience. So making sure that men and women get that experience is very, very important. And I think it's very important to be respectful of the laws of the countries that you're working with, but make sure that you treat everybody with dignity and respect. And I would actually say, sometimes it can be challenging, but then it's very important to be successful and develop talent. And I would actually say, my team would say about me, we would always find a way.
Yeah, no, it's definitely resourcefulness is one of the top skills needed of any senior HR professional. So it's interesting to hear. I want to move a little bit more now into what the work that the LGB Alliance and the LGB Alliance Business Forum does and hopes to do. And I want to just step back in time a little bit. And when did the whole area of pronouns and bringing your whole authentic self to work in in that form, when did you first notice it? I mean, I remember quite clearly when it came up for me, and I was at university, and in my first weekend there, I went along to the meeting of the LGBT Society, and everyone was given a sticky label to write your name and then add your pronouns. And I thought, what's that? And I looked around and I saw that all the other guys had written he, him. So I just wrote that. And then that was really the first time. And then, I remember it being embedded into a lot more in the university environment. I then remember stepping into the corporate world and finding it there. When was it for you? When did you first experience that? When did you sense that shift in mood?
We're back on.
Yeah.
Hello.
I think we're there. Did you?
Yeah, great. So I've worked for 3 decades in personnel or HR, and there's diversity and inclusion really started for me in early 2003. And so there's been a sort of an evolution. And I think I'd just like to point out there was a big change in about 2015. And in 2015, when just after same-sex marriage came in, I think it was 2013, Stonewall had actually they delivered they delivered their purpose. And around 2015, I did notice a big shift with the T. And a lot of people who were gay or lesbian felt probably say unwelcome. And I think there was that shift. But by that time, Stonewall had entrenched itself into most large organizations with their award ceremonies, their index. It was seen as very important. For me, the pronoun sort of snuck in 2018, and I just noticed that people were saying he, him, they, and to me that's fine. And just my analogy, because I like to keep things simple, I remember when we had an IT upgrade in Outlook, I think it was, and remember when you could put your picture in and you could see who you were talking to. So it was important I thought as an HR person that it would be good to see who you were talking to and the picture of the person. I remember talking to the leadership team and I just said, I think it would be good if everybody could put their picture so that they could take the picture and put it in. And I remember some people had a real problem and found it very invasive and actually offensive to put their picture on. So HR, you always find a solution to something, and you don't want to make anybody feel unwelcome and not included. So I said, if you don't want a picture, you can choose basically anything that you feel comfortable with. And I think one person put a picture of a cat and one person put a picture of a cricket bat, and that's fine. And that's how we navigated through. And I think in terms of the pronouns, if people wanted to put certain things in their footers, that's fine. But I think what I realized that it was more about how the individuals wanted to sort of dictate and force other people on their values and their ideology. And to me, that it was a slow creep that, well, on the one hand, you can do whatever you want. If you want to put a cricket bat, that's fine. But then when an organization makes people feel unwelcome and not included because they don't use the pronouns, I think that gets into dangerous territory. And when inclusivity becomes exclusivity, I think it can be very harmful.
Mm.
I totally agree, and you have to really look at it for what it is. It is it becomes initially a request and then moves into a demand. It's and I think there's a more general question to be asked about compelled speech, and there's always a world of a difference between a request from a friend and a diktat by a complete stranger, and especially when there's some corporate power that goes behind that, and potentially now that we see individuals facing disciplinary sanctions or even worse in some cases. I think it's definitely something that's gone too far.
I think so. If I can just mention 2 things, HR should not be the police. So my role in organizations and senior HR, my role often was to go into organizations and basically change the culture of the HR function. And I think acting like the police is just not. I think it doesn't get the best out of people, and you've got to always look at what are the objectives of the organization, what are the customers, who are the customers that you service, and what's the market you're in. One thing that happened in the Scottish Parliament, can I mention Lanyard Gate? I don't know if you heard about Lanyard Gate.
Yeah, please.
So if I can just give you the background to Lanyard Gate. So here I got this. So when I first went into Parliament, I was very proud to have my rainbow lanyard. But then I found out that one of the women's groups was basically told off and told to take her she had a purple, green and white lanyard, and she was told by the security guard who was wearing, a number of our security guards wore the lanyard, as we did as well. And he told her to take it off and told her to take her colours off. And it was just after the women were expelled from the committee room over the Gender Recognition Reform Committee stage 2. And I just happened to be down in the reception, and I saw a bit of a kerfuffle. I said, what's happening here? And one of the women actually said, this is what's happened. She was really distressed. And I said, would you like to come up to my office? So she came up to my office. She told me what had happened. Now, when one person's rights and ideology trumps another person's rights, and that's wrong. So I actually wrote a letter to the head of security. I raised it with the Scottish Parliament corporate body. I raised it in the chamber. And it's called Lanyard Gate now. And basically, the Scottish Parliament made the decision, the right decision, that employees of the Scottish Parliament should have neutral lanyards. And here we are, the neutral lanyards. You've either got green, and I think it's purple now. So that was very, very important to happen. And I think there was an example where what should have been inclusive became actually aggressive and wrong.
No, you're completely right. And I think there's often times when you can see individuals who are ostracized for choosing not to wear a rainbow lanyard. I remember talking to a colleague working in investment banking not too long ago, and he's, much to his shame, he's had to buy a Help for Heroes lanyard, and he's almost sort of had to create this false story about why it's so important to him that he wears this Help for Hero lanyard. But the truth is he's being hassled by younger employees around him of why he's not wearing a rainbow lanyard. And so I think we can see that in a lot of areas, especially with adding pronouns to email signatures, those kind of things. It's one of the small things that organizations can do to step in and be able to put a neutral step in. I fully agree. On that theme a little bit more generally then, I think what we say is, what we're looking at the LGB Alliance Business Forum is we want to start conversations with CPOs, group HR directors, those kind of people. And I think when I talk to people in my network, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, there's a bit of a feeling that they've lost control. They're a little bit embarrassed of what's happened. There's activist groups who are part of staff networks who've taken on a little bit too much power. They have certainly acted beyond their, they often act beyond their scope of authority. They then bypass any sort of internal checks and balances to be able to make sure that the organization acts appropriately and ultimately in the best interest of their customers and shareholders. But I think that there's a little bit of embarrassment in that. And one of the aims of us trying to get in front of many of these CPOs and HR directors is just to say, look, we understand how this happens. It's not an easy thing that you've been up against. And, we want to then, hear firstly about your experiences and then understand how we might be able to help you row back from there. So is that something that you've seen where activists embedded in organizations have taken on too much power? And, what would you maybe say to HR leaders who feel a bit embarrassed and want to look for ways to rectify that?
I fundamentally believe after 3 decades in HR, and also I'm a fellow of the Institute of Personnel, I'm the only fellow in the Scottish Parliament. I believe you get the HR function you deserve and you get the networks you deserve. And I think you have to work with the network. So I was a founder member in Shell of the Women's Network, both in London and The Hague. And I was a member of the LGBT networks. And those networks, because I was in the HR function, we worked together. And often organizations, my belief should, if they're giving financial support and actually time off for getting involved in networks, then they have a responsibility. The networks have a responsibility to work with the organization. And I think, sometimes organizations just become organizations for themselves rather than organizations and networks for the parent organization. So I think one of the things that I fear about the HR function is it has lost its way. and it's drinking the Kool-Aid, and it's a certain Kool-Aid that just is not right. And I think there needs to be a big reset. Just as every decade there's a reset of the HR function. It was the welfare organization. I mean, the CIPD itself was started off in 1930. I think it was 1913. It was a group of, I think it was 29 women and 34 people. It was set up for the welfare of women's rights. It then became the IPD, CIPD, and always. And when I became a personnel officer, one of the aims of a personnel officer was to be on the board and to have a voice. Well, you're not just given that voice, you have to earn that voice. And I think when I look at some of the HR professionals now, or the people function, I'm just going, what are you doing? Where's your leadership? Where's the truth? What are you doing to challenge? And I think it's very healthy for HR and people professionals to move through different organizations. You have to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And I think that's what's happened in people functions and a lot of the HR functions that have lost their way in this space.
Can I
It's
pop in
very true.
about truth, actually? Is that okay? We've been, and this is not as the forum, but this is LGB Alliance, but we've been contacted on more than one occasion from people who've been in staff networks for decades, some of them, and it's been an LGB staff network. But then they've been told it must be an LGBT staff network, and inevitably it's a guy that steps in, often a heterosexual guy, who steps in to then run that network. And they come to us because they feel that, you know, same-sex attracted people are sometimes, you know, disadvantaged by being teamed up with the T, because there's some disagreements. And I'm wondering how I think that's an increasingly, that's a big problem. I'm wondering what you would say about that. But also, I suppose what we would say is that we need to find a solution to this, and we just can't keep on fighting about it. But it's not easy.
No, I think it has to start off at the top. Fish heads rot from the top. And I think it has to start with the chief executives and the boards of those companies. Because what interests your boss fascinates you. And so if I was in an organization where I felt I was fighting against the tide, I would move. If I would never be the head of HR in an organization where I can't align myself to the values of the chief executive or where the board is going. And I think that's why HR professionals can't get too comfortable, and they have to make sure that they are aligned with the values of the organization and can give guidance and direction. So HR are not followers, they're leaders. And advocating and the ability for advocacy is very, very important. And I think that's why the best HR people and the best change leaders are those who basically, as I say, what interests you, boss, fascinates you, finding a way to navigate through, and then you bring the organization along with you, and creating a positive, vibrant, welcoming culture. And where you've got toxicity in that organization, it's cultiver notre jardin. You have to sort of, you know, weed out where there are toxic issues, and it does require time. And that goes back to networks and the HR function, getting the networks and the HR function that you deserve. I think, you know, one of the advantages of organizations that are innovative, they can adapt, but those organizations that are not innovative will die. And there is a big difference between the private sector and the public sector. So most of these issues that are happening right now, and we've got the case at NHS Fife, and are in the public sector, and you have to ask, where is the HR function in that? Where is the board in that? Where is the accountability? How has it got to this stage? And you just would not get to where it's got to.
You're completely right. And I think it's a really helpful way to think about it. But as the saying goes, you get what you tolerate. You know, the standards you walk past are the standards that you accept. And you're completely right about HR taking more of a leadership role on that one and being the ones to lead the way. It's interesting where Kate came in there, and it's really builds to my final question. But I think what we see a lot of now is LGB people sort of self-selecting out of groups that were supposedly there to represent them. You know, they now feel that essentially they're dominated by heterosexual individuals who identify as trans or queer or something along those lines, and they feel that it doesn't represent them. They're looking to separate themselves. It's not of interest anymore. So I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of intentional mixing up of the LGB and the TQ plus. I mean, what would your approach be, and what advice would you give to organizations to start rectifying that? And I suppose double-ended to that as well, what would also you say to LGB people in organizations who do feel disenfranchised at the current state of affairs?
Yeah, thanks for that, Toby. I just want to pick you up on get what you tolerate. I challenge that use of language because patience is very, very important. So tolerating
right.
things to different people, and it suggests a judgment. So I think sometimes you have to suspend judgment. So I just wanted to pick you up on that point. In terms of, there is a big difference between, the way I see it is LGB is reality and the TQI is an ideology. And the two are they're completely different. I think people have a choice. And it's very important that people know that they've got a choice. Somebody like Sandy Beggy, you know, in NHS 5, she didn't have a choice. She'd worked there for 30 years. She found it offensive, as I would do and many women would do, to change and feel uncomfortable changing in front of a fully intact a male, and, you know, have her rights sort of trumped by somebody else's rights. And I think in terms of that, and there was a key example of an ideology trumping, you know, a biological fact with protected rights. So I think there has to be a reset. And as I say, the HR function need to show leadership. And something that came up at your last webinar, there was a comment made about and there was a slightly negative way about a comment made by the CIPD about bring your professional self to work. Now, I have a different view of that. When Peter Cheese, the head of the CIPD, said last year, bring your professional self to work, to me, that was a massive change and a positive change. And I think it's very important when you've been in HR for over 3 decades. There was a period of about 10 years where it was a big thing to be able to bring your whole self to work. For me, you know, when I was early career, I used to borrow a man. I think it's called beard. You borrow a beard. So you borrow somebody when you go into important events. So I used to borrow my friend Matt. And I'd say, Matt, will you come to this event with me? Because it was easier for me and I wanted to fit in. And then, you know, when I moved to the Netherlands in 2003, it was so wonderful to go to company events. And Thora was my expat wife, and Thora come. And that was me bringing my authentic self to work. And I think, you know, because you're operating, you're very, very professional and you're operating, you think it shouldn't matter. I'm very private, but it does matter because sometimes you do want to be your authentic self. But what Peter Cheese was saying was that you shouldn't be coming to work and imposing your ideology on the organization. And there was a very good Dutch saying about, and it's, I think, in terms of pictures, there's the me bird and then there's the organization bird. And it's very important that you keep the two balanced on your shoulders. And when the organization bird or the me bird gets too big, it starts sort of pecking at your head. So the psychological safety is really important. And I think in terms of this, and LGB and TQ, I think it's important to say that the two are very separate. And I was pleased to see when the LGB Alliance was set up in 2019, that was a very, very bold and important shift change. And I think the HR function really does need to catch up.
I think you're right as well. So just to say, about being able to be out at work, I can remember I had a job and I think it was my first job in London. I was on the Strand outside a magazine place. They used to have magazine stands, and I was buying a copy of Gay Times, and I'd asked the man for it, and he had it still in his hand because he was talking to someone else. And I turned around, and to my horror, my boss was queuing up behind me. And even though I'd handed over the money, I sort of scuttled away without it because for some reason I thought it would be terrible. It would be terrible for him to know. So I do think you're right that young people in particular will have seen you and thought, well, she's done all right. She's a lesbian. She's a really, senior person at the top of her game. It's not going to hold me back in my career. So I do think you and other women like you really make a difference, particularly to young people. So well done.
Thank you.
It's that positive role modeling effect, though, isn't it? It's so important to have someone who you can look up to and see what's possible for you. I think especially when you're younger, and not necessarily just about being young going through education, but just early in career, it's important to have those role models and someone you can find and see, I could see myself being like that. I could see myself doing that. And I think that's where, individuals like yourself, Tess, do a great service there. So look, with that, I'm going to hand back over to Kate for some closing questions. So thank you.
Yeah, I get the I'm not sure if these questions are easier or harder, Tess, to be honest, but really I just wanted you to let us know, being out, you've given us one example of how being out at work was really positive. Is there any differences between being out as a politician and in your previous professional life, and what are the pros and cons, and have you ever thought honestly, oh, I wish I'd kept it to myself?
That's a really hard question. So at work, when you are different in any way, any organization, there's elements of prejudice. And if you prick us, do we not bleed? And sometimes people say some very stupid things. And you expect better of the HR function. Sometimes HR people say some stupid things. And people think they're being funny, and it's not funny, it's offensive. And I think I would never say to anybody, I think you do have to develop a thick skin and be resilient. But Toby's point about role models, it's very, very important that you have, as you're going through your career, that you have people in your professional life who are go-to people that you can offload, you can talk to. And sometimes I've had extra help. I do quote often the Serenity Prayer, to grant me the courage to accept the things I cannot change. Is it the wisdom to change, or the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference? And I think that every day gives you refreshing. If somebody makes an inappropriate comment that is quite hurtful, what do you do? And I think there are ways of coming back at it. Sometimes it's ignorance, and you just think, gosh, we've got a bit of work to do here. And sometimes, you've just got to make sure that you're always in control yourself, because once you say something, it can be very hurtful and as an HR professional as well, you've got to lead and be a role model by standards. And often it's coaching moments. And I said at the start, I was a black belt in karate. And the thing that karate's taught me, it's knowing when to attack and when to defend. And it's all about timing. I mean, I'm 5'2". And when you're 5'2" in a male-dominated industry, when I first started off, I remember my boss patted me on the head, 1986 or something. And you used to, when you're a young woman, sometimes you get patted on the head and your bra ping. This is, you just don't do that. And I think, that was the 1980s. There were different issues in the 1990s, and now the issue right now is pronouns, and every 5-10 years there's a battle. I think a key point here is we have to make sure that we move forwards and we don't regress, because we have, as women, hard fought rights, and as gay people, hard fought rights. When Thora and I We had to sign the London Partnership in 2003 for Thora to be my expat wife. Fortunately, we had the London Partnership. We got married in 2005 in The Hague, and it wasn't until 2013 that it came in England. And in terms of, there's always something more, and the main thing is not to give up, is just find a way to charter through to bring about change. We are at a pivotal point right now in terms of our rights as women and gay people being eroded, and how to navigate through that is a challenge. But we have wonderful organisations, LGB Alliance, we have Sex Matters, we have For Women, we have Murray Blackburn Mackenzie Women's Rights Network, you know, all these wonderful organisations that I was doing a timeline, and they sort of started, I've got it in front of me, started in about 2019. All these wonderful organisations. On the sports side, we had Sharon Davis, Mari Yamuchi, and in every area. The only area that really we haven't got enough advocates pushing is education. That is a huge issue, particularly in Scotland right now. So on the sports side, we've got some role models. In work, we've got CIPD and Peter Cheese actually making a change. But the public sector is a huge issue right now. In Scotland, I think it's employs more people in the public sector than the private sector. Huge issues happening right now in schools, hospitals, rape crisis centres, where the Scottish government have basically, the ministers have given accountability. They've delegated accountability to organisations like LGBT Youth Scotland that are being paid sort of £500,000 to deliver change into organisations. So they've basically just stepped back and now allowed these ideological groups to take hold, which is frightening and it's alarming.
No, I totally agree. And I think that's another webinar in its own right, how these thousands of groups have sprouted up and spreading, you know, what we would say often is quite poisonous ideology into absolutely every facet of our life.
And publicly funded, paid for by the taxpayer, which is alarming. When Children in Need pulled their funding from LGBT Youth Scotland, questions should have been asked and still should be asked. In organisations, I know organisations have started to withdraw their funding into Stonewall, and that is the right thing to do. You can't delegate accountability, and you can't allow organisations, lobbying organisations, to actually produce policy. It's wrong.
I mean, Tess, you do an absolutely fantastic job of speaking up, and I'm just wondering if you've got advice to anybody that's watching who wants to enlist the help of their MSP or their MP. What's the best way to go around it? Is it public meetings? Is it meeting with them? Is it writing to them? What should the viewers be doing to get more Tess Whites interested?
Yeah, that's a really good question on two things. For those people who are HR professionals, I think the Scene organisation is a great organisation where HR people are coming together, making sure if you have more of these webinars, very, very important. I would actually say write to your MPs and write to your MSPs, but don't just do standard letters. There'll be a standard element, but tweak it and make sure you know who you're writing to. You might write to Maggie Chapman. She's got one view. You might not say the same letter to Maggie Chapman that you might be to me and my colleagues. Alex Cole-Hamilton, I've challenged him in the Scottish Parliament. He accused me of dog whistling. You know, you can accuse me, but nobody could ever say that I am homophobic, transphobic. And I think in terms of my track record speaks for itself. So I think your MPs, your MSPs, and just keep at it. There was one organisation. So in the Northeast, we've got this terrible industrialisation of the Northeast with these monster pylons and huge substations. It's the wrong kit in the wrong place. There's one very innovative group that's created this artificial intelligence letter writing, and it's tailoring the letters to the MSPs. It's very, very effective. I think making sure, and I think the peaceful protests outside the front of the Parliament are very, very important. And I know that you're doing policy papers and questionnaires, and I think that's very, very important. The work that Sex Matters are doing is very important. So on LinkedIn, I make sure that I say to Naomi Cunningham, you know, great, really good job. And I think LinkedIn is a great tool to do that. So, you know, networking, more of this. And as you said at the start, Kate, we couldn't have done this a year ago.
No.
I think the very fact that we can start having meaningful conversations, and now we've got a language, and we can say that there is a big difference between LGB and TQI, and we can say that it's wrong to force people to use pronouns, and doing more of that and having that respectful discussion and debate, and not being afraid to challenge, such as I did in Parliament with Lanyard Gate.
Well, absolutely. And I'm glad you said networking, because we're hoping to have a summer event, and I'm very much hoping that you might agree to come along and be our star speaker. More info about that later. But I would just say everything that you've said today really aligns with our thinking in the Business Forum. And it's that the gay rights movement succeeded because it brought people with it, and because it was respectful of the feelings of others. And I think that's a place where we need to be again in the workplace, bringing people with us, being respectful, not assuming that my right to do something trumps somebody else's right to do something, just to create a more harmonious and ultimately a more efficient and effective workplace, because that's what matters as well. So,
Yes,
Tess, I'd really like to say it's been fantastic. It's absolutely whizzed by the time. Thanks so much. And thanks so much, Toby, for actually knowing what he's talking about, because it's not my area, but it was just brilliant, really, really refreshing and fantastic to hear from you. And thank you so much.
Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you very much, Tess. Thank you, Kate. Bye-bye.